Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. We always appreciate you sending us interesting stuff. And this week, someone sent in a presentation that really caught our eye.
Yeah, it's titled Ansiedad es el enemigo, which, translates to anxiety is the enemy. Pretty thought-provoking, right?
It is, and it's by Dr. Miguel S. Porto. Anxiety is something so many of us deal with, so we thought we'd take a deep dive into what Dr. Porto has to say about it.
Absolutely. So today, we're going to unpack his insights, explore what anxiety really is, and when it crosses that line from, a normal feeling to a real problem, and most importantly, what we can do about it.
Yeah, that's the key, right? Like, how do we actually manage this thing? But first, I think it's important to understand what we're even talking about here. Dr. Porto starts off by defining anxiety as a natural emotional response.
Right. It's how our minds and bodies react when we sense some kind of threat. So like that worry, nervousness, or even fear we feel, that's anxiety.
Okay, so it's not necessarily a bad thing then.
Well, not inherently. Dr. Porto actually refers to it as having an adaptive function. Think about it. Back in the day, our ancestors faced all sorts of real dangers.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, like saber-toothed tigers and, rival tribes and stuff.
Exactly. So that surge of anxiety, that heightened awareness, it would help them react quickly, fight or flee,
Makes sense. So in a way, anxiety was kind of keeping them alive.
In a way, yeah. It's like a built-in survival mechanism. It sharpens your senses, gets your heart pumping, all that. But of course, the threats we face today are usually a bit different.
Right. It's not so much about running from tigers anymore. But I still get anxious before a big presentation at work.
Oh, for sure. And that's where Dr. Porto makes a really important distinction between what he calls common anxiety and pathological anxiety.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Well, common anxiety is that kind of temporary feeling tied to a specific situation, like your presentation. It's usually proportionate to the actual threat, and it actually can be kind of motivating,
Oh, so a little bit of anxiety can actually be a good thing.
It can be. It helps you focus, prepare. Dr. Porto even says it can push us to grow, to face those challenges. But then you have pathological anxiety.
And that's where it becomes a problem, right?
Yeah, that's the kind that sticks around, even when there's no real threat. It's excessive, disproportionate, and it really starts interfering with your life, like your work, relationships, your ability to just function normally.
Gotcha. So how do we know if our anxiety is normal or if it's becoming that kind of problem?
Well, Dr. Porto outlines some key symptoms and signs to watch out for.
Okay, like what?
Physically, you might notice things like your heart racing a lot, what they call palpitations, or you're sweating more than usual. Maybe your muscles are tense all the time and you feel exhausted for no reason.
Yeah, those are all pretty familiar.
Right. But it's not just physical. You might also notice your thoughts are racing, or you're constantly worried about things, even small stuff. It becomes hard to concentrate.
And that constant worry, that can be so draining.
It really can be.
Yeah.
And it can lead to other things too. Like you might become more irritable, more easily frustrated, or you start avoiding situations that trigger your anxiety, which can lead to social isolation.
So you're not going out, not seeing friends because you're worried about feeling anxious.
Exactly. It becomes this vicious cycle. But okay, so we've talked about what anxiety feels like, but what actually causes it?
Right, because knowing the why might help us figure out the how to deal with it, right? So Dr. Porto lays out several categories of causes.
Yeah, he starts with the biological stuff, things that are happening in our brains and bodies. He points to chemical imbalances in the brain, which can make us more prone to anxiety.
Chemical imbalances? What does that even mean?
Basically, our brains rely on a bunch of different chemicals, neurotransmitters, to regulate mood and how we respond to stress.
Okay, so it's like our brain chemistry.
Yeah, you think of it that way.
Yeah.
And when that chemistry gets out of whack, we can become more susceptible to anxiety.
I see. And then he talks about psychological causes, which I guess is more about how we think.
Exactly. So Dr. Porto points to things like negative thought patterns. That inner voice that's always criticizing you, telling you you're not good enough. Or catastrophizing, where you always imagine the worst case scenario.
Oh yeah, I do that all the time. What if this happens? What if that goes wrong?
Right. And that kind of thinking can really fuel anxiety. He also mentions past traumas, like big emotional events that can have a lasting impact on how we see the world and how we react to things.
That makes sense. If you've been through something really tough, it can definitely make you more anxious.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, there are the social causes. Dr. Porto talks about the pressure we face at work, the stress of relationships, just a general dissatisfaction with life. And he also points to the impact of being in an environment where you're constantly judged or criticized.
So it's not all in our heads. The world around us can really contribute to anxiety.
No, it definitely plays a role. And then there's the genetic component. If anxiety runs in your family, you might be more likely to experience it yourself.
Oh, so it can be inherited, like a predisposition.
Yeah, that's right. But it's not a guarantee. It just means you might be a little more vulnerable to developing anxiety if other risk factors are present.
Okay, so genes aren't destiny. Good to know. But Dr. Porto also has this other causes category, and some of these are really interesting. Like, he says we can learn anxiety through imitation.
Right. So think about it. If you grow up around people who are always anxious, who worry all the time, you might start to pick up those same patterns yourself.
It's like we learn by watching others, even when it comes to anxiety.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy, but it makes sense. And then he talks about personality with perfectionistic traits as another factor.
Perfectionism, how does that lead to anxiety?
Well, perfectionists are constantly striving for these unrealistic standards. They're afraid of making mistakes, of not being good enough.
So they're putting all this pressure on themselves.
Exactly. And that pressure can be incredibly anxiety-provoking. And finally, in this other causes section, he gets into some more technical stuff, like neurotransmitter imbalances.
Okay, I'm going to need you to break that down for me.
Sure. So there's this part of your brain called the amygdala, which is really important for processing fear. If your amygdala is overactive, it can make you feel scared and anxious, even when there's no real danger.
So it's like your brain's alarm system is on overdrive.
Yeah, something like that. And then there are these neurotransmitters, GABA and serotonin, which are like your brain's natural calming agents. If you don't have enough of them, your brain has a harder time regulating anxiety. It's like the brakes aren't working properly.
Wow, so there's a lot going on inside our brains that we're not even aware of.
Right. It's really complex.
Yeah.
But understanding all these potential causes can help us make sense of why we feel the way we do.
Absolutely. Now, Dr. Porto also throws in some intriguing facts about anxiety, and these were really eye-opening. Like, did you know that women are actually more prone to anxiety than men?
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. It points to the fact that there are probably a lot of factors involved, maybe hormonal differences, societal pressures, even how men and women tend to talk about their feelings.
It makes you wonder, right? Like, what's going on there?
It does. And he also mentions how things like wars and climate change can affect people's anxiety levels. It's like those big global stressors can have a real impact on our mental health.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It's hard not to feel anxious when the world feels so uncertain.
Exactly. And speaking of how widespread this is, Dr. Porto points out that 19% of Americans experience anxiety. That's a huge number.
It really is. And it makes you realize you're not alone in this.
Not at all. And it's not just older folks either. Apparently, young adults, people between 20 and 35, are the most affected group.
Maybe because that's such a stressful time of life, starting careers, relationships, all that.
Could be. Now, moving on, Dr. Porto also breaks down the different types of anxiety disorders.
Yeah, there's a whole list of them. Why is it so important to know the difference between them?
Because even though they all involve anxiety, the specific triggers, the way they manifest, and even the best treatments can vary.
Okay, so walk me through them.
All right, so first you have generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. That's when the worry is constant, and it affects pretty much every area of your life.
Like you're just always on edge.
Exactly. Then there's panic disorder, which is marked by these sudden, intense episodes of fear that can be really debilitating.
Panic attacks.
Exactly. And then there are specific phobias, which are those intense, irrational fears of specific things, like spiders or heights.
Yeah, those can be tough to deal with.
They can be. And then there's social anxiety disorder, where people are really afraid of social interactions, of being judged or embarrassed in public.
So like they avoid parties and stuff like that.
They might. And then you have obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, which involves intrusive thoughts and compulsive behaviors.
Like having to wash your hands 100 times a day.
That's an example, yeah. And finally, there's post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, which can develop after someone experiences a traumatic event.
So like after a car accident or something like that.
Yes, or any kind of traumatic experience. Now, it's important to remember that all these different forms of anxiety, they can have some pretty serious consequences. It's not just about feeling worried.
Right, because it affects your whole life, doesn't it?
It does. Dr. Porto mentions how it can mess with your work or school performance, make it hard to sleep, lead to social isolation, even increase your risk of depression.
And that all adds up to a pretty significant decrease in your overall quality of life.
Exactly. But the good news is, it doesn't have to be that way. there are things we can do about it.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to address some of the common myths surrounding anxiety because those myths can prevent people from getting help. So what are some of the misconceptions that Dr. Porto tackles?
He goes after 3 big ones. First, there's the idea that anxiety is a sign of weakness. He makes it clear that this is simply not true. Anxiety is a common human experience, often rooted in those biological, psychological, and social factors we talked about.
Yeah, it's not a character flaw. It's something that happens to a lot of people.
Right. And then there's the myth that it only affects, like, nervous people.
Like the stereotypical worrywart.
Yeah. But Dr. Porto points out that anxiety can affect anyone, regardless of their personality.
It doesn't discriminate.
Nope. And finally, he addresses the myth that there's no cure for anxiety.
And that's just not true, right?
Not at all. Dr. Porto emphasizes that anxiety is treatable and manageable. There is hope.
That's such an important message. So, what does Dr. Porto suggest for actually managing anxiety? He mentions both therapy and medication, right?
He does. For therapy, he specifically recommends cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
Okay, so what is that in a nutshell?
Well, CBT is a type of therapy that helps you understand the link between your thoughts, your feelings, and your behaviors. It teaches you to identify those negative thought patterns that are fueling your anxiety and to develop healthier ways of thinking and reacting.
So it's like retraining your brain.
Yeah, kind of. And then on the medication side, he talks about antidepressants, which can help regulate mood, and anxiolytics, which are specifically designed to reduce anxiety symptoms.
So the medications can provide some relief while you're working on those long-term changes in therapy.
Right. But Dr. Porto also emphasizes the importance of self-care, things we can do on our own to manage anxiety.
Yeah, like what?
Well, he talks about the power of deep breathing exercises. Just taking a few deep breaths can really calm your nervous system down.
Simple but effective.
Exactly. He also recommends mindfulness and meditation techniques, which help you focus on the present moment and quiet all that mental chatter.
That's a good one. I need to try that more often.
I think we all do. And then there's good old-fashioned exercise. Getting your body moving can really help reduce tension and boost your mood.
Yeah, that's always a good idea for so many reasons.
Right. And he also stresses the importance of getting enough sleep. Lack of sleep can make anxiety way worse.
Oh, yeah, I definitely noticed that. When I'm tired, everything feels more stressful.
Absolutely. And finally, he recommends being mindful of stimulants like caffeine and trying to cut back on screen time, especially before bed.
So creating a calming bedtime routine can actually make a big difference.
It can. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Dr. Porto's presentation, what do you think are the most important takeaways?
Well, I think he really drives home the point that anxiety is incredibly common. It's not a sign of weakness, and there's no shame in seeking help.
Absolutely. And understanding anxiety, like really getting to know its symptoms, causes, and different forms, that's the first step towards managing it effectively.
Knowledge is power. And Dr. Porto also emphasizes that there are effective treatments out there, so there's definitely hope.
Yeah, that's key. And talking about it openly, sharing our experiences with others, that's a huge part of breaking down the stigma that surrounds anxiety.
I agree. We need to normalize these conversations.
Exactly. And speaking of conversation, Dr. Porto actually has a call to action at the end of his presentation.
What does he want people to do?
Well, he encourages people to leave questions or comments on his presentation. He also provides his email address, miguelsuarezporto@gmail.com, for anyone who wants to reach out directly.
Great. And if anyone's in the Houston area, he includes information about Novus Medical Center.
Yeah, their address is 7095 A Highway 6N, Houston, Texas 77095. And you can find their website at novusmedicalcenter.com.
So after spending this time exploring Dr. Porto's insights, I think the biggest takeaway for me is that understanding anxiety is empowering. It's not about viewing it as this undefeatable enemy, but it's about recognizing it for what it is and knowing that we have tools to manage it.
And what's really fascinating is how Dr. Porto presents this spectrum of anxiety. From a normal, even beneficial response to something that can really take over your life, it really makes you think about your own experiences,
Yeah,
right?
it does. What resonated with you most from what Dr. Porto shared? And is there even one small thing you might try based on what we've talked about today?
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, and I hope this deep dive into Dr. Porto's presentation has been helpful for you. Thanks for tuning in.
And thanks for sending us this thought-provoking material.
Yeah, keep it coming. We'll see you next time.
See you then.